Thank you. It's 11:20, so the hearing is now resumed. So before the break, we heard from a number of people, and now we'll look to the Council to provide some response to that, please.
Thank you, sir. I'll ask Mr. Wood to respond first, please.
Thank you. Just sort of 3 or 4 points I'd like to come back on. The first was just to group, I guess, a range of different types of comments about the historic environment, and clearly references to sort of various reports. I think we just really want to sort of state the position that in terms of the heritage topic paper and the heritage impact appraisal and the link through that to the site selection work, that really this gives us a robust and very much up-to-date assessment and view on the issues around the historic environment, and I think we'll leave it at that because clearly that plays out in other areas of discussion. Point 2, just really around the exceptional circumstances. Clearly we've touched a lot on housing and points made that clearly there are other development needs. Really just point to section 7 of the TP1 addendum, where clearly there is an examination of development needs beyond just those of housing need. The third point I'll come back on, I guess, just a case of getting the sort of the maths right, and we set this out in our response, that the position is that when we add the suitable SLA sites up, the current permissions and the windfall allowance, then the shortfall when we get to 2033 is, I won't give you the precise figure, but it's about 2,000 homes, so it's 2,000 as opposed to 1,000. And then lastly, the fourth point, in terms of this issue about maximising opportunities within the urban area, I think we just really point to the Council's windfall paper, SD49B, just to really highlight that there has been a very careful assessment of the windfall contribution. And probably on balance, that there's issues sort of on both sides there. Clearly there are constraints, but there are opportunities as well, and clearly the windfall paper has looked not just at, I guess, the sort of the city as in terms of the sort of the main built-up area, but it's clearly looked at all built-up areas and sort of other villages and settlements within the boundaries. So we've tried to look in a broad sense at that. And then related to that, that we have sought to optimise densities in terms of making sure that we are maximising the contribution from those opportunities that are within the urban area, but clearly, particularly through the design policies as well, that is done in a very careful way so that there is optimisation, but clearly that's done in a sensitive way, just sort of bearing in mind, I guess, the points about overdoing it on densities. So I think that's sort of the main points I want to come back on from the discussion. Thank you.
So should I get at a couple of points briefly? I mean, the first one I think needs to be noted that subject, as usual, to Mr. Courtier, there is a widespread agreement that exceptional circumstances can be shown in this case. I think it's important to recognise that, accepting, of course, that you will be revisiting this for individual sites at stage 2. But there is widespread acknowledgement of exceptional circumstances arising as a matter of principle here, both in relation to housing and employment use. The second point, just to build on the response to Mr. Butler, the topic paper addendum deals specifically with density at paragraph 7.79 to 7.84. And this, we say, confirms the view that we have looked to exhaust possibilities for development within the urban area before looking to green belt sites. As for Mr. Courtier's comments, Ms. Hubbard, as well, about the 1994 inspector's report, we do say that it's almost a statement of the obvious, but we're obviously not in 1994 now. Matters have moved on substantially, not least in respect of the evidence base that is before you. the documents that you have in front of you, and to which extensive reference has been made over the last few days, including the heritage impact assessments that Mr. Boudge referred to, have all come along, obviously, since then, in a policy context which also has moved on. So we say one should recognise that and judge the proposals that are put forward by the Council on their merits in that context. Mr. Kersey also wants to emphasise that, I think in his words, you must be very careful as to how you relate new development to York and its historic character, and there's absolutely no dispute about that. Indeed, the very allocation that he is seeking to dispute in Stage 2 has been arrived at out of a desire to protect the historic character of York by avoiding more development towards its centre and around its urban fringes, whilst at the same time providing for an allocation that's sufficiently large and strategic to provide for infrastructure, and particularly transport infrastructure, that creates a sustainable settlement in its own right. As for his headroom point, I don't think there's any dispute now that headroom, as it's put in Guildford, flexibility is mentioned also in the judgment as well. There's no dispute that that is a relevant factor as part of the exceptional circumstances test for the reasons that we've already given. And I can refer you to paragraph 5.2.16 on page 4 of our Matter 2 hearing statement, as well as paragraph 2.5.18 as well in the same statement, for further confirmation of the approach that's taken by the Council. Mr. Kersey returned to this point about figure 3.1 as well. We reiterate that figure 3.1, as the TP1 addendum identifies, is not the end point in the Council's consideration of the historic character of York. That work has been supplemented by the heritage impact assessments and the topic paper, which provide further detail beyond the strategic notations on that plan. And as regards the harm to the historic character of York, it's important that you look at Annex 5 ultimately, sir, because the Council does recognise that there would be aspects of harm caused, rather than flatly denying it, as it appears to be suggested by Mr. Kersey. But it does reach judgments on the extent of that harm, which it says nonetheless justify the allocations that are proposed. And as I've said before, the overall distribution of housing is supported by English heritage, with a view to avoiding further incremental, more harmful development incrementally by expanding the urban area in central York. Mr. Tucker's points, I think, in reality, go to phase 2. We will obviously be debating employment need there. I'll return to Mr. Hobson's opinion under safeguarding rather than dealing with it here. Mr. Johnson referred to the appeal decision on ST2. We're happy to add that to the examination library, and we'll do so. Thank you.
Mr. Grundy.
Thank you. Just for two very short points of clarification. Firstly, following Mr. Wood's recent comments, just can we clarify that windfall technical paper? I heard SD49, but I may have misheard.
The windfall topic paper is in SD 049B.
Cool, thank you. Just on the second point, in response to Mr. Courtier, Mr. Linus spoke about inner areas having potentially more historic harm than ST15. I don't think that's true for all parts of the land towards the city centre. I think there is a difference in terms of potential historic impact. There's a significant difference between the east and the west of the city, but I think we'll come on to that in terms of historic impact and inner greenbelt boundaries. Thank you.
Mr. Cossey.
Sorry, I'm sorry to pursue this point, but Mr. Linus has said that they accept harm, and that has been part of their site selection exercise. So I have to take you to 7.116 of the addendum, sir. And that is a flat statement, and this has been produced post-submission, sir, when the council had full knowledge of everything that's in the heritage impact assessments, etc. The sites allocated within the general extent of the York Greenbelt have been done so without damage, sir, without damage to its primary purpose to preserve the setting and special character of York. And then in 7.117, you find the sentence, the release of sites within the general extent of the York Greenbelt will again, this bland assertion, will not damage the overall purpose of the Greenbelt as a whole. So I think we do need some clarification. Though that has been written, sir, after, presumably in the light of the full an appraisal which has been carried out in the rest of the addendum and has obviously informed, appears to have been the basis for the agreement to release the sites. Thank you.
I think that the point is you need to read 7116 in the light of Annex 5 and the detailed judgments that are reached in relation to each allocation within that document. And as you go through that, you'll see that each site is considered against the Greenbelt purposes, and judgments are reached on the extent of harm, including various judgments that minor harm would be caused. So the council has accepted that there would be a degree of harm in the individual cases that are assessed in Annex 5, and it's important you look at Annex 5 when reaching your judgments.
Sir, can I just come back on that point? Because
if you bear with me.
Sorry,
yeah, I mean, look, are those sentences correct? Do they accurately reflect the council's view, or should the word unacceptably be inserted before the word damage?
Yes. Yes, unacceptably should go in before. I think that's quite clear when you read the detailed judgments in Annex 5.
So I accept that as a change, sir, but that is, I have to say to you, a significant change in position of the council. And does undermine much of what has been said, sir, up to now. And sir, this I must repeat the point, this document is meant to set out these paragraphs are their conclusions after the end of potentially assessing harm. So I think that I fully accept that Mr. Linus now realises that those assertions can no longer be maintained, but it undermines the credibility of the council's evidence base.
Well, we just do not accept that, because it's almost as if Mr. Kirshire hasn't read Annex 5. I mean, it's quite clear that we've reached judgments on the sites in there, and we'd ask you
Had,
to...
had the authors of the addendum read Annex 5?
Oh, yes, well, they would have done, yes.
So was it a slip of memory to not include the word unacceptably?
I think it just may have been...
It's just wrong, isn't it?
I think that's fair, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's
Yes,
a fair
I think that's
assessment.
fair. I think that's fair.
Okay, thank you. Is that all, Mr. Cossier?
Yes, sir, I think that's the big point I want to get over.
Does anybody have anything else under exceptional circumstances 3.6? Nope. Oh, just beat the bell there. Mr. Wedgwood.
Thank you, sir. It was just a brief question, really, because the point was mostly dealt with by Mr. Cossier there, about the duty to cooperate and the relationship between the duty to cooperate and the granting of exceptional circumstances. If it turns out that the council has not properly asked all of the other local authorities to provide some space for housing development, then is it, you know, I think that should be taken into account with regards to the exceptional circumstances. And I had one particular question that I wanted to ask, is when the council went to the neighbouring authorities and they were told that there was not sufficient land that they could help them, did the government subsequently change the targets for those local authorities, and did they go back after that had happened, if it did? Thank you. So.
Is that a question the council can answer?
Sorry, just repeat, could I ask the question to be repeated? Targeted.
Yeah, certainly. So the question was that you've told us that you've gone to the neighbouring authorities under the duty to cooperate and asked them if they could take over some part of the housing delivery that we need to have in York for this plan. And as I understand it, they told you that they couldn't at that time. Now, when they told you that, at a later point, did the government then reduce the targets on any of those local authorities for the amounts of development that they had to provide within their own areas? And therefore, had they been preparing for a larger amount of development and then found that they didn't need to meet that? And did you go back? Thank you.
So I think this, I suspect, relates to a point about standard method figures being used by other authorities, which we've already covered in the duty to cooperate session, in particular the relationship with Selby.
You have. I think it's a fair question there that Mr. Wedgwood puts. I think in essence the point is, if I may, Mr. Wedgwood, and if I get this wrong, do let me know. I think what Mr. Wedgwood is saying is, look, don't your neighbours now have lower housing targets than they did when they refused your advances for taking some of your housing need? And have you been back to them since they've had those lower targets? Have I got that right?
That's correct. Thank you, sir.
I think I'm told that the council hasn't formally gone back to the other authorities recently since those targets or the announcement of the standard method has come forward, because Selby in particular are still at the stage where they're working out what to do with the standard method, and that's happened only since September this year, and the preparation of the plan has taken place on the basis that was discussed in the duty to cooperate sessions that the agreement for York to deal with its own needs was taken through the preparation of the plan and before the issues of the standard method came up with Selby in particular in September this year. And it's that process that's informed the preparation of the plan.
Yes. And I think the underlying point that Mr. Wedgwood was making is, well, if you haven't gone back to them, you don't know if they would accept accept housing on behalf of York now, and that is something that goes to the demonstration of exceptional circumstances. Whilst Mr. Wedgwood couches it in relation to the duty to cooperate, the complication, I think, is that that's a duty that relates to plan preparation and hence ceases to be a duty with which the council must comply once the plan is submitted. Is that right?
The duty to cooperate does relate to plan preparation, but I think, sir, our point would be you've got to be realistic about how the plan's being prepared, you know, in the sense that the Greenbelt release allocations and so on are themselves part of the preparation of the plan, and we say there is an alignment in that sense with the duty to cooperate, because the work to identify where Greenbelt allocations should go, the extent to which needs can be met within the urban area or other land outside the Greenbelt, that's clearly part of the plan preparation. And there is an alignment, we say, in that respect between the policies that we're promoting now and the duty to cooperate discussions that have taken place. And at the moment, even if one looks now, we simply don't know from Selby's point of view which approach they're going to be taking. So for those reasons, so you have to adopt a degree of realism as far as the preparation of our policies is concerned, because insofar as we have looked at whether or not land can be accommodated outside the green belt and brought forward our allocations, that is fundamentally intertwined with the duty to cooperate discussions.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else under exceptional circumstances? No, in that case, I think we will move on to question 3.7, which deals... Sorry. Yes, sorry. It's going back to 3.4, sorry. It's nearly Christmas.
Yes, unfortunately, rather than forging ahead to 3.7, we're going to take a slight shimmy backwards to question 3.4. That's the issue of safeguarded land. And, quite simply, should the plan identify areas of safeguarded land between the urban area and the green belt in order to meet longer-term development needs stretching well beyond the planned period? And notice the word development rather than housing.
So I'll ask Mr. Wood to summarise position on this, please.
Thank you. Clearly, the plan and the Greenbelt approach has been very mindful of the need for it to be capable of meeting longer-term development needs well beyond the plan period and the issue that the boundaries shouldn't need to be altered at the end of the plan period. I think, as we've already heard this morning, sorry. Thank you. There are different ways of doing this. That's already been sort of covered to a certain extent, and I guess that just sort of echo the point that neither the framework or the RSS prescribes such an approach of safeguarding, and the framework references that where necessary, plans should identify safeguarded land. The Council's position is that safeguarded land is not necessary, so I guess the short answer to your question is no. But clearly it's important, going back to those sort of points I sort of opened with, that an alternative approach is adopted and an effective approach is put forward. So the approach involves that sufficient land has been identified on several of the strategic site allocations with build-out rates that extend beyond the planned trajectory. So that's the overall approach. Clearly recognised there's already been some comments around some of the risks associated with that. So I guess just some points to highlight around that. Just generally in terms of the plan's overall approach, there's a 10% non-implementation rate that's been taken into account in terms of accounting for sites and current permissions within that trajectory. Secondly, there's been very close working with site developers and site promoters to ensure that the build-out rates and delivery timescales, lead-in times, to ensure that they are realistic and appropriate. So that work, as I say, has been done with those site promoters and developers, and those assumptions are just covered again in terms of sort of further information on that in the SHLA SD 49A. Also, as mentioned earlier, there are a number of different sites that do this, so there is some flexibility within that. I guess an additional point, just really sort of tying into some of the broader discussion in terms of historic character and setting, is that the Council's position, and in terms of its assessment, where it feels that it's been able to assess those sites better than it would be able to assess safeguarded land, because it's more clear what the sort of impacts and implications of those are. And I think it also ties into the comment that Mr. Linus made earlier in terms of really there's a certain sort of size with these sort of in fact the new settlement locations, and in terms of their sustainability.
If I do forgive me. In relation to historic character and setting, why is the council able to assess? I wasn't quite sure what the point was. Site allocations better than safeguarded
I think she's got
land?
a better idea of exactly where the development would take place in terms of the work that's been put forward, and in terms of the site selection work in the open space, and in terms of the policies developed for the individual strategic sites, it's been able to get a better understanding of what the development implications would be on those locations, rather than a broader parcel of land which a safeguarded land would be.
Is that because you've drawn on work undertaken by landowners, stroke developers, stroke promoters of the sites, and so you have some sort of idea about what's likely to go where on the proposed allocations? Is that what you're getting at?
That is correct, but in addition, we're able to put development principles, so the strategic policies that are set out in Section 2, the spatial strategy of the plan, have specific development principles relating to any mitigation, for example, that we need to require on site, and that comes from our understanding of the nature of the development that is proposed in those allocations.
But wouldn't you, though, be equally able to do that in relation to safeguarded land? Because it would come through a review of the local plan, wouldn't it? So would you not be able to undertake that same work in the future?
Yes, in the future.
Well, safeguarded land is pretty much about the future, isn't it? unless I'm mistaken, my understanding is it's land that would not be developed during the lifetime of the plan that we are presently looking at,
So I think,
without
yes,
review.
I think the point is if you are choosing to safeguard land, the preferable approach I think the council has chosen to follow is they think it provides greater certainty by dealing with strategic allocations now. And if you're at the decision point now as to whether to allocate or whether to safeguard land, you have more information in relation to strategic allocations now than you would before you take the decision to safeguard land now. True it is that at the review stage you'd have more information then, but the decision point is now, sir, and we have more information on strategic allocations than we would in relation to strategic land, safeguard land.
Did I interrupt your flow, Mr. Wood?
Thank you. Well, it was helpful just to try and work out where I am on my notes. Thank you, sir. So, yes. Really, I think it's just to then come back to clearly this issue of how far is well beyond in terms of that period. What we've already highlighted is that going beyond 2038, that there would be a minimum of additional 2.5 years of housing supply. Beyond that, I'm saying minimum because there's discussion earlier in terms of the York Central issue, which clearly we've still got to resolve the timescale on that. Clearly we're aware of the range of responses and quite a wide range of views on what the length of that period should be, and it is clearly a matter of judgment. The council's view is that whether it's sort of 7.5, 8.5 years, that in effect the council is through the plan is therefore in effect planning for a plan period plus another half planning period beyond that. That sort of 7 or 8 year period is in effect that further half a plan period, and it's considered that is a balanced approach, so that it is planning well beyond but not planning too far ahead where there are inherent uncertainties about what needs and issues they may be needing to address in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Just one short point. I think it's been made already, but it arises more specifically here. The Guildford judgment, just for your reference, sir, EX of/4, paragraph 104 illustrates that again in that case the headroom in Guildford meant that safeguarded land didn't have to be provided. So the broad principle of the approach being taken by the council is consistent with the approach that was taken there.
Okay. Does the NPPF insist that local plans include safeguarded land?
No. Paragraph 85, which deals with the identification of safeguarded land, is prefaced with the words "where necessary." So there's no automatic requirement to do it. As Guildford illustrates, as I've just identified. And for the reasons that we've given, we say that it's not necessary in this case to safeguard land because of the approach that's been taken to the strategic allocations, which we say offer greater certainty and meet the same objective of meeting longer-term development needs, stretching well beyond the planned period. What beyond the planned period means is really a matter of judgment. There's no fixed time limit that one applies. In this case, you have a planned period ending in 2033 with, for the reasons we've given, land that is available in the supply that goes beyond 2038 to at least another 2.5 years after that. So if one's looking at 2040, 2041, the land that's been allocated gives you a supply of around about 50%, 50% of the time of the plan.
Forgive me, Mr. Ives, I don't have the trajectory to hand.
Yeah.
I think I've heard now 3 things in relation to, and this is housing delivery,
Yeah.
that it would go to 2038, 2040, and I think you just said 2041?
Yes, it's because the 2038, the trajectory goes to 2038, and that's EXCYC 11B. The trajectory appears in a number of different places. That's the most detailed one. And in the hearing statement, it said that there is an oversupply at the end of 2037, 2038, which amounts to roughly 2.5 years supply. So 2.5 years, 2040, 2041. But the best document to locate that is EXCYC 11B.
Is there anything in national policy or guidance that helps us out in relation to what where necessary means?
We don't think there's anything else specifically within the NPPF. It's a broad judgment to be reached, we say, in the circumstances of the case. We would, as we said, rely upon Guildford, which shows that as a matter of principle it appears to have been accepted before applying the NPPF policy. So we think it's a broad judgment as to what where necessary means.
Okay, but the approach taken by the council here then is seeking to ensure that the Greenbelt boundaries will endure until, what are we thinking? We're thinking around 2041-ish now, are we?
Yes, sir.
And in relation to housing, you say that that is achieved through the headroom.
Yes.
Yeah, just so I'm absolutely clear, I've just written here that the council says, yes, the principle is for the Greenbelt boundaries to endure until around 2041. Have I got that right?
At least that time, yes, sir.
At least 2041. Yes. And that's a matter of Greenbelt principle.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And in relation to housing, we need to be convinced of all sorts of things that we've already heard about, including the need for housing, the housing requirement, and, well, you know, and delivery, which we haven't looked at
Yes.
yet either, but lots of other things that we have still yet to examine.
Yes, that's fair, sir.
And we have to agree that the principle of headroom, as you will say, in line with Guildford, is an acceptable way forward.
Yes.
In relation to other uses, does the same principle apply? Because I'm asking that because you've just confirmed that this is a principle that relates to the green belt. So if we were for one moment to assume that we agree with you about all of those things in relation to housing, is the idea, the council's approach here, to ensure that the same applies in relation to other development types, including employment and, at the risk of exciting Mr. Tucker, educational needs?
Sorry, sir, bear with me. Yes, sir. Just checking a reference. The TP1 addendum deals with this issue in relation to employment at paragraph 7.42.
So that was paragraph 7.42.
42, sir, on page 59, where it recognises that the plan should provide sufficient flexibility and the ELR update adjusted floor space requirements to take account of development and reflect a plan period up to 2038.
Okay, so what I'm getting at here is that the council's approach is to ensure that all needs for the plan period and beyond until around 2041 are met through the provisions in this local plan. Is that right?
Yes. Yes, sir, it's right.
For all development types. And I'm asking because we've got lots of different needs yet to examine. For example, in relation to gypsies and travellers. You're welcome. As I mentioned earlier, employment, land and land needed for educational purposes of various types. And you might preempt, Mr. Linus, what I'm about to ask. If we disagree with you in relation to the needs relating to those different sorts of development, would the council's approach be to allocate any additional land needed or something else?
So if I can do the last point first, I think if you were to disagree, consistent with the approach that's been followed, the council would look to allocate. In relation to educational needs, again, I think at the risk of repeating what we said before, we understand that there is a debate to be had with the university over need. And we say that that is better addressed at stage 2 to be reflected through an allocation. As far as gypsy and traveller needs are concerned, again, we don't think it's necessary to safeguard for reasons that we touched upon yesterday, that we think that adequate provision has been made within the allocations as they stand, but to the extent that any other need has to be addressed, then that would be dealt with through gypsy and traveller needs policies. So we don't think it's necessary to safeguard land in that respect.
What I don't frankly want to do today is to scrutinise what people say the need is for various different things, because that will be very much coming along as part of phase 2, and before Mr. Wright says anything, I haven't preempted that phase 2 will happen. But for the moment, and present purposes, assuming it does. So that's not a road I want to go down. I think from the council's viewpoint, just so that everyone's absolutely clear, what the council is saying is if we were to disagree with them about the level of need, that is to say that this plan was not meeting need until 2041 in any respect, then the council's approach or response would be to seek to allocate land through this plan. Have I understood that correctly?
Yes, we're just checking. Sir, that's right, and the reason for it is, I understand, is that as the plan has progressed, the consultation responses have expressed a preference for the certainty that's provided by allocations. And that's been the approach that's been followed by the council to date, and that would be the approach that would be followed should you disagree with the points that we've been putting to you.
And should we disagree with the council about the need for housing? If, for example, we were to conclude that the OAN most appropriately identified should be a higher figure, and thus that potentially, thus at least, the housing requirement should be a higher figure, would that same approach apply?
Yes, sir. I think the answer to that depends on the extent to which you would be seeking to uplift the OAN, because obviously if a relatively minor uplift, we would say the position doesn't change in the sense that there would still be the headroom or flexibility, and we would stick to the approach that's been followed. But if you were to uplift the OAN, or recommend uplift the OAN to a higher degree, depending on what that was, then again the approach would be to allocate land rather than safeguard. But I think we'd need to see what the conclusions were on that first of all.
Yeah, I might regret asking this, but I'm going to do it anyway. What if we had a combination of those possible outcomes? If we disagreed in relation to OAN and the need for other things, would the council's approach be to align the point in time for which needs were met? So is it basically, and I'm asking this because you say the point here is about having a green belt boundary that endures to a particular point in time. You're saying, I think, if we think the need for housing is a lot greater, then, well, you might have to concede that you can't go all the way to 2041, and you might, as a consequence, set it at an earlier point in time. If that were the case, would you look to align the point in time to which you were meeting other needs as well? Is it about alignment of meeting needs for different types of development? Or would there be reasons for meeting needs to different time over different time periods?
So
I know it sounds all very hypothetical, but I'm just trying to see what the principle is, because it may, play into discussions in phase 2.
So I think I might need to take instructions on that, if you don't mind. We understand the point about alignment between different uses, and perhaps we can reflect on that and come back to you.
Is that something to reflect on over lunch or a bit longer?
I think
is it an item of homework to prepare a written answer?
We can try over lunch, sir, and if we think we need to reflect on it for longer, we'll tell you after lunch and put it on the list of homework.
Grateful, thank you. Mr. Grundy.
Thank you, sir. I think the first point I was going to make has already been covered in your discussions with the council just now. Of course, before you get to safeguarded land, the amount of housing land allocation we say should be significantly increased to help combat the affordability issues and massive under-delivery of affordable housing that's been already identified. And paragraph 85 of the MPPF not only requires the council to look at safeguarded land, but bullet point 3 also directs safeguarded land toward areas between the urban area and the green belt. So in this case, it's looking towards the inner boundaries to provide that safeguarded land is what's needed to be done. More land, more housing land, and also safeguarded land is needed not only to allow for development needs, identified needs during the plan period, but also the period beyond. It also helps serve to guard against non-delivery, under-delivery or delays to development on allocated sites. These problems are most likely on regeneration sites where remediation and or infrastructure problems may need to be dealt with, where high densities may cause harm to quality of development and or mix of housing. We've seen on many, many occasions in the past those problems arising to significantly harm expected delivery rates, expected starts on site. I attended a Chamber of Commerce meeting in York earlier where a leader of a party for York Council considered that spades in the ground would happen on York Central during 2019, and that's clearly never going to happen. We doubt it will happen even in 2020, but I think what I'm trying to do is simply point to the likelihood of significant delays to those expected timescales. Thank you.
Mr. Keogh.
Thank you, sir. I think we've made clear our position in our statements that we feel there's a pressing need to include safeguarded land within the plan. If it's one thing the history of this plan preparation has taught us, and the history of the discussions on Greenbelt in York has taught us, is the need to take a longer term view than the council has taken in the past and is taking now. I think part of this...
longer than 2041?
Yes, sir, yes. I'll come on to that in a minute in terms of the plan period. I think there's been, I refer to this in very general terms as a completely apolitical point, but I think there's been a pressure in York to, suppress is not quite the right word, but certainly keep housing down to as little as possible as what's needed in political minds. I've referred to statements that have been made by various leaders of the council in the past. And that's led to, in my view, a short-term approach to housing delivery and to the housing issue. We're already 2.5 years into this plan. I do want to address the plan period. I didn't address it yesterday because I wanted to bring it into this discussion on safeguarded land. So I'm looking at SD 049A, figure 6, the Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment. It's the more detailed breakdown of the delivery expected from sites over the plan period. So we're at 2019, we're in 2019, so we're 2.5 years into the plan. I'll go out on a limb and I'll assume that the plan won't be adopted by next April, which means we'll be 3 years into the plan period. And as you can see from that detailed trajectory, on year 3 of the plan, in other words 4 years in from 2017-18, is when the council is expecting to see over 700 units delivered from strategic sites. So that's a year and a half away from now, when there are no, with the exception of ST8, the Redrow site at Monk's Cross, on the other major strategic sites, there are no applications even submitted. So I think you've got a real problem here with the plan period and how it relates to the review of the plan going forward. Because whilst some may argue, well, if we haven't delivered in the early years of the plan, those allocations simply push forward into later years of the plan. That doesn't hold water, because what you will also be carrying forward is a backlog. So we're already 2.5 years into the plan, and already measured against the 790 OAN, and we've set this out in our evidence. There's a backlog of about 500 units has accrued in the first 2.5 years, but the first 2 years, the first 2 monitoring years.
I'll take that, Mr. Keir, as a general
It's a point. Yes, indeed, sir, yeah.
What I don't want to do, what I'm not going to do, is have an argument about the specific figures, because I will be looking at the question of supply and delivery in detail as part of phase 2. And you never know, the numbers might have changed by then anyway.
They may well have, sir. They may well have been dramatically increased. But yes, sorry, I was going to accept that point.
They will have. They will have, sir.
I was going to accept that point, that this is something that you're going to look at in more detail in phase 2 and on the issue of 5-year land supply. But I'm just making the general point that we're already several years into the plan, and clearly there are questions over the delivery of some of the major housing allocations, not in terms of in principle, simply in terms of actually just getting started on site. The other point, of course, is that once the plan is adopted, it immediately becomes subject to MPPF 2019, which sets out a requirement that plans must be reviewed at least 5 years after adoption. So, which brings me on to another point, which is we've had some discussion about the misalignment between the housing requirements of adjoining local authorities, in particular Selby. If we were to assume, again, we're in the realms of assumption here, let's assume the plan was adopted this time next year, so you're 2.5 years in, and the council says, well, we'll hold off review for 5 years. You would be 8 years in from 2017 before a review of the plan. So any misalignment between the housing requirements of, say, Selby and York would simply have been magnified. So that brings me to the general point that there's a lot of uncertainty about where the plan is going in terms of delivery of strategic sites, well, delivery of housing sites, and the timing of the start on site of housing sites. There's increasing uncertainty the further we get into this process about the plan period itself. And then the more general point that we make in our hearing statement is that York clearly is under significant development pressure. And in an area where there was, say, less development pressure, you might be able to take a more relaxed view about what is meant by well beyond the plan period in paragraph, third bullet point of paragraph 85 of the MPPF. So we argue that in view of the uncertainty surrounding the plan period that I've just highlighted, the uncertainty surrounding the OAN, which we discussed last week, the uncertainty surrounding the delivery of sites, the timing of delivery of sites, highlighted by Mr. Grundy, and I'd entirely take on board his points. The history of delivery of sites, brownfield and greenfield sites in York, demonstrates the uncertainty about, it highlights the uncertainty point. Those point to the need in my view, for safeguarded land to manage the uncertainty, but to also give the plan and the council a degree of flexibility in how they manage and deal with unexpected needs or shortfalls going forward. So that's why I say the Greenbelt boundary, in order to ensure that the Greenbelt boundary would endure for at least 25 years, you would need safeguarded land to help in that process. Sir, just again to highlight Mr. Grundy's point about the difficulty in delivering strategic sites and large sites, and this is a general point. The site behind us, the Terry site, was vacated in 2005. Development didn't start until 2013, and that was what is regarded as one of the most desirable sites in the city. Likewise, sir, on the Germany Beck site, which again I think was approved in 2006, again, work on that site, the completions of the actual start of construction, putting in the access road, didn't begin until around 2014. It just highlights the problems that can arise in bringing forward large strategic brownfield or greenfield sites. And safeguarded land, the whole purpose of safeguarded land, it's there to help manage that uncertainty and to provide that degree of flexibility.
Mrs. Winter.
Thank you, sir. The identification of areas of safeguarded land is essential to meeting future development needs, stretching well beyond the plan period in line with paragraphs 83, 84 and 85 of the NPPF. It's required to provide a degree of permanence to the Greenbelt boundaries in the long term in line with paragraph 79 of the NPPF. As Mr Tucker highlighted earlier, the Council has sought Council opinion reference EXCYC/11A in relation to the determination of the Greenbelt boundary and the need for safeguarding land. And I'll draw to your attention two particular paragraphs within this opinion. Paragraph 9. In accordance with paragraph 84 of the NPPF, authorities are also required when drawing up Greenbelt boundaries to take account of the need to promote sustainable patterns of development. This requires consideration of the development needs of the area, which should be objectively assessed. As paragraph 85 makes clear, this involves consideration of the development needs which are to be met during the plan period, and also the longer-term development needs, stretching well beyond the plan period. Quite how far beyond is a matter of planning judgment, but in my opinion, a 10-year horizon beyond the life of the plan, as mentioned in my instructions, would be appropriate. The next paragraph that I want to draw attention to is paragraph 16, in which Mr Hobson states, in my opinion, if no safeguarded land is identified in the emerging local plan, this would give rise to a serious risk of the plan being unsound. Obviously, we consider that the Council's reliance on large new sites and urban extensions and new villages, which claim to have build-out rates beyond the plan period, is unsound. And therefore, they've mentioned that this is future-proofed approach and spatially planned, but is not consistent with the framework. In support of Mr Grundy's points, we therefore question whether the approach that the Council has taken in relation to the Guildford decision is correct. We question whether there is sufficient headroom in having only a 2-year supply beyond the plan period. Thank you.
Mrs. Jukes.
Thank you, sir. Just to start with, going back to question 3.3, the first part of the question actually raises the issue around will the greenbelt boundaries need to be altered at the end of the plan period, but that was with reference to the permanence of land features and whether there were appropriate boundaries that were being drawn actually on the ground, and to provide the context, whereas but there's still the element of that question around whether the greenbelt boundaries need to be altered at the end of the plan period. Now, paragraph 83 of the MPPF talks about the boundaries enduring at the plan, how the boundaries might endure at the end of the plan period, obviously with reference to how we were phrasing the question 3.3, but then it's paragraph 8.5, 85, that actually talks about how the greenbelt boundaries shouldn't need to be altered at the end of the plan period. And there's a distinction there, I think, between what's the MPPF is trying to get at in terms of paragraph 83 and then paragraph 85, because being satisfied that they will not need to be altered at the plan period is quite a distinct test that I think when you mentioned earlier the question about reference to the words where necessary, 2 bullet points ahead of before the bullet point around local authority being satisfied that the boundaries don't need to be altered. I think that's where the link is, because the where necessary comes back to local authorities being satisfied that the boundaries don't need to be altered at the end of the plan period. And this is where safeguarding comes into play, because that safeguarding land is the mechanism by which the government expects local authorities to make sure that the boundaries can endure in the long term, because they're being set to take account of future and long-term development needs. Now, we hear from the local authority that that the allocation of land to meet strategic development needs in respect of predominantly residential development is a means by which they're looking to protect the boundaries and ensure they can endure beyond the end of the plan period. But all of a sudden, I mean, this morning, well, this afternoon, it's getting a bit confusing because the plan and all the evidence has been based around the additional land meeting development needs up to 2038. And now all of a sudden we're talking about them enduring up to 2041. But that sort of undermines the basis of which the evidence has been prepared, because all the assumptions the council's worked on is that the land will last till 2038. To suddenly say that actually there's some uncertainties around that and it could end up until 2040. What's the evidence say? You know, that's not very sound, and it's a bit worrying that the assumptions can change so much. But obviously strategic allocations, the ones that appear in the plan at the moment, that's predominantly focusing on residential allocations. It doesn't meet the needs, as we've heard, of other types of developments. And really that's a key crux of why safeguarded land is required to meet that wider breadth of development within that next plan period. What's worrying me quite a lot about the current approach as well is what we're basically talking about, and this idea of, oh, well, the local authority, if they want to provide some further flexibility or headroom, would look to allocate land. Well, hang on a minute. Also, we're allocating land beyond the end of this plan period, but where's the strategy? Where's the strategy to actually shape that allocation of land? You know, what? It then begs the question, well, why not just extend the strategy period as well? But then if you're extending the period of the strategy and all the land allocations, you're ending up with a new end of plan period where you've raised the same issue. Where's the safeguard land? How are you going to make sure that the boundaries can endure beyond that plan period? So you can't, you know, there's a real fundamental issue here around this idea of, oh, well, we'll just allocate a bit of extra land for a few extra years beyond the end of the plan period because that'll mean that the boundaries endure. But what about strategy? It's absolutely fundamental that the allocation of land is shaped by strategy. And that's where then the idea of safeguarding land comes in, because for safeguarding land, you don't need the strategy. You're just saying that these sites can be released from the green belt because they won't undermine the fundamental purposes of green belt, but they provide the flexibility to ensure that the green belt...
Do forgive me, Mrs. Jukes. Is that right? You don't need to have a strategy for safeguarded land? You can go anywhere.
No, it can't go anywhere. No. The strategy is around the purposes of Greenbelt. It's the tests of Greenbelt that you've been talking about further this morning, the exceptions tests, and around setting boundaries that can endure. Now, the council did actually look at safeguarding land at the beginning of the plan process, and there were actually a couple of stages of the initial process that included the suggestions to safeguard land. The last version looked to safeguard 300 hectares of land. So to take 300 hectares out of Greenbelt and safeguard it for future development needs, that's for all different types of development needs. And this is where the flexibility then comes in, because if you're only allocating for strategic housing requirements, you're not looking at that full breadth of development requirement. And if 300 hectares was seen as a reasonable amount of land to safeguard, to make sure that the boundaries could endure for the long term, then there's a comparison to be made there about the flexibility and the purpose and the durability of the plan as currently prepared, because of that figure. Just by way of example, as you're aware, I'm here representing a number of different clients. Two of those clients actually were to have land safeguarded, and they are both strategic employment sites, as identified in this current plan. Neither have room to grow in the next plan period because there's no land safeguarded. If we're talking about meeting development needs for 5 years post 2033, well, their needs aren't taken into account because the boundaries have been drawn so tightly now around those allocations, they have no room to grow. And we already know that those sites are both going to be developed out within the early phases of the current plan period. So by the end of plan period, there will be no land available. And actually, there'll be a real issue about where the local authority then goes to meet those employment needs. Just to mention as well, those two allocations, both of those allocations actually already have planning permission now. We were able to demonstrate that the needs were so great for employment land that exceptional circumstances were demonstrated, so those sites have now got planning permission despite them currently being in the green belt. So it shows the pressures on land and the need to make sure that we have sufficient land going forward. And also, I mean, this thing about needing to obviously look towards the end of the plan period. So what we've got at the moment is a plan that goes to 2033, and then the NPPF paragraph 85 says that the local authority needs to satisfy themselves that the boundaries won't need to be altered at the end of the development plan period. So we've got then sort of like 7.5, 5 years, we're not quite sure, we've got an amount allowance. But because of that requirement in the NPPF, and the fact that paragraph 47 then talks about needing to identify for land for possibly up to 15 years for the new plan period, then actually there is literally insufficient land now to ensure that the boundaries will have to definitely be altered at the end of this plan period to meet the development in the next plan period because of that requirement of paragraph 47 that talks about needing to allocate for at least 10 years and possibly 15 years. We know that there isn't that amount of land there. Now, the council also talk about in paragraph, in document TP1, paragraph 5.65, how the council, the expectations that the green belt should be permanently, and they're advocating that they would remain unchanged for a period of at least 20 years. If we look at other local authorities, most of them have actually taken an approach of 30 years. So in the case of Wilmslow, Kirklees, Bradford and Calderdale, they all have boundaries that were set to take account of a period of 30 years in order to allow for permanence. And in all instances, they actually safeguarded land as well to ensure that they could do that. And I think there's also, within that council advice that Ms Winters referred to, I think the council actually advocated the idea of 25 years. So 20 years is fairly short compared to what's typical as an approach to actually safeguarding and ensuring that green belt boundaries can be permanent. Thank you.
Mr. Good.
Thank you, sir. Oh, a bit of feedback. In short, we consider, as you'll see from our statements, that they should be providing safeguarded land. Kind of intrigued by the council's responses. They might want to allocate up to 2041, which seemed a slight departure from the end period of the plan, but we'll see where that goes. I'm also very, very intrigued by the council's response that the land and the sites that they have will currently deliver to 2041. The reason of my my unease with what they're saying is if we look at their trajectories, so if you look at CYC 16 or 17B, whichever one you choose, that shows those sites delivering up to 2038. Now, I understand the point that the council made that they say that they would over-deliver by 2,000 units. If that is the case, is A, either the trajectory wrong, or B, are they not proposing that any development will happen after 2038? Because the two don't quite sit together. Because if the trajectory is right, all of your sites will finish by 2038. If not, you're suggesting that some of those sites will carry on longer, in which case the trajectory is wrong. I also point, if the trajectory is right, and I won't go at this stage into the housing requirement arguments we had last week, but I will note that the council said the 790 was a minimum figure. They quite pointedly made that point. Therefore, if it's a minimum figure, what is the harm of going over it? And is the 2,000 units actually an oversupply, or is it simply fulfilling the policy? My statement would be it's the latter, and that's what the NPPF tries to make you do in terms of the boosting supply significantly, the positive way in which you should plan. Also, if you look at the trajectory itself, and you, which we have done, sir, in our hearing statement, tot up what those allocations are purported to do post-plan period, i.e. post-2032-33, you actually only have 1,752 dwellings from those sites, which is actually 2.2 years supply. I recognise that the council also anticipate that windfalls will carry on post the end of the plan period, but even then, you only get to around about 3.6 years supply at best. Sorry, 3.29 years supply at best, which is some way short of enduring well beyond the plan period, at least in my eyes. A final point, if I may, sir, there is also the issue which Mr. Keogh raised around the need to look at the plan again and review the plan within 5 years, which will be invoked in terms of para 33 of the new NPPF, the 2019 version. If we look at what that's currently saying, is if you haven't done that review at that period, at that point in time, the standard method would then be invoked. And as we know at the moment, that's around about 280 units higher than the plan requirement which we have in front of us. Which in essence would mean that by the time we got to 2032-33, you would actually be in deficit, not in positive. Which I think is quite a telling argument and quite a telling thing for the council to consider. So will they actually endure beyond the end of the plan period? I recognise some of that's conjecture and things may change. But there's significant uncertainty that they will. And even if they do, that delivery beyond the plan period is actually quite minimal, and we reckon around two and a bit years. If we don't take into account the windfalls, if we take into account the windfalls, it's only 3 and a bit years by the council's own evidence. I really don't see how that is enduring well beyond the plan period. To my mind, that's quite the opposite of it. And I think where the NPPF talks that where necessary in terms of safeguarded land, to my mind, that's if you can identify other sources of supply. You may not need to go and safeguard land in the future. If you aren't identifying other sources of supply, which I'm not aware that the council are, and I'll think of other examinations such as Cheshire East, where they were at pains to identify all sorts of other sources of supply, which could endure beyond the plan period. I think we are in a case here where we do need to look at safeguarded land, or at least alternatively look at alternatives to provide further flexibility. Now, if that's through allocations, it's an interesting choice which the council make. I'm not going to argue against that necessarily, but it's an interesting choice. They could look at reserve sites either, sir, which had a phase-in date on them or were invoked if they were suffering from a 5-year supply issue. I've probably covered enough ground there that, and I'll let others jump in there after that, sir.
Mr. Natkus.
Thank you, sir. I think this all comes back to paragraph 85 and does partly link to question 3.3, which is about ensuring that the Greenbelt boundary doesn't need to change at the end of the plan period. And I think that's what this whole discussion is about, and we need to be absolutely sure that that is the case. And what we do over this stage and the next stage is ensure that this plan does last that period of time. And I think that the Council's opinion that's been referenced made it absolutely clear that safeguarded should be looked at to make sure that's the case. However, it then did give an out to the Council, which is this flexibility in allocating more sites. And in the Council's statements, they've confirmed that's the route that they've wanted to go down. And again, today, they've confirmed that's the route that they'll continue to go down. And I personally don't have an issue with that. You know, if it's either safeguarded land or its allocations, it gets us to the same point, that we ensure that we've got sufficient land to go beyond the plan period and meet the needs, so that we're not reviewing this green belt when it comes. Where I do have an issue, however, is that we need to make sure that that's actually delivered. It's okay saying we're not going to safeguard because we're going to over-allocate, but if those over-allocations don't actually come to fruition, then we're not achieving what we're setting out to do. And I'm sure people will touch on it, but it's clear to see in the trajectory that Mr. Goods just mentioned that when we get to the end of the plan period, we can't simply refer to an over-provision. We've just delivered housing in accordance with the plan. So what we have to look at is the years 16 to 20 that are in that trajectory and see if the council are delivering the houses they need. And we had a discussion last week, and I think a modification was posed, that the plan was going to say that they deliver 790 a year in that period. And it's clear from looking at these figures that even including windfall, by the 5th year after the plan, we're at 269 homes. The year before that's only 388 homes, and the year before that, only 549. And similarly for the year 2 years after the plan. So we're clearly not hitting these figures or getting anywhere near them. And indeed, when you look at the trajectory, into years 17, we're wholly reliant on 2 sites. There's only actually 2 sites that go beyond the plan period at present. That's ST15 delivering 280 and ST36 delivering 100. All the other sites have either built out or haven't come forward. So even the council's own evidence is demonstrating to us that if we go down the route that they're proposing as not safeguarding but over-allocating, there aren't enough sites being allocated, or the sites that are being allocated aren't of sufficient size in order to deliver that 5-year post-plan period. We did put some figures in our statement where we looked at the actual policies, because the policies identify the amount of homes that will be delivered post-plan period. And York Central's an interesting one because it says it's between 200 and 1,000. We've heard this morning that the over-provision may be actually delivered in this plan period, not beyond the plan period. So again, we should be looking carefully at actually how many of those can be delivered, and are the figures in the trajectory accurate. And it also includes barracks that aren't going to be released until a later date. And even if 100% of the allocated sites post-plan period came forward in the immediate future, they wouldn't deliver the 790 a year if they were all delivered in the 5 years after the plan period. The numbers simply aren't there. Now, it's obvious they're not going to be delivered that quickly, particularly the Barrett site, so it will come down. So it's, for me, it sort of exacerbates the point that I was saying yesterday, that the council have made a real binary choice here, in that they either feel that land needs to be greenbelt or allocated. There's no sort of in-between. There's no land that simply doesn't need to be greenbelt and may come forward at a later date, be it white land, be it safeguarded land, or actually be it included in the allocations, and allow those allocations to determine the numbers by providing some flexibility. You'll have seen from our various statements that we've made comments on site specifics. A comment was made earlier by the council that safeguarded land is very difficult to assess in as much detail as the allocations. But again, I disagree with that, because the 2013 plan did a detailed assessment of sites, and it included a whole host of other sites. It included sites that had been deleted. It included larger versions of existing sites that had been allocated. And you can very simply look at the Matter 2 statement from the council with the key diagram from then and the key diagram from now. There's not a massive amount of difference in it, other than the sites have reduced in size and the odd sites been deleted. And that hasn't been because a reassessment's been done of the green belt. It's because a reassessment was done of the housing requirement. And then a decision was made as to which ones are effectively the worst of those sites, and we'll delete those out. It'd be very simple to go back, and if a decision was needed that safeguarded was needed, or indeed actually we go down the council's route and we allocate more, it's very easy to find those sites where that can happen. We can go back to the previous versions. The SA has assessed bigger versions of sites such as ST7 and ST14. It's assessed ST11. There's been site assessments of them. They've been out to public consultation. It's quite simple to quickly add on the extra few thousand houses that you need in order to start to fill this trajectory out. So I think I'm happy with either option. I don't think there's a flaw in what the council are doing. It follows the council's advice that they had, but actually they're not delivering it because there's insufficient homes being provided for in the latter parts and going beyond.
Mr. Butler. My apologies, Mrs. Hubbard.
Thank you. Can I take you back to the reasons that you were given for the council adopting a plan which consists of just allocations and a residual green belt, namely that that would provide certainty? I suggest it would do the opposite. Just to take one example, and I won't go over all the comments that have been made previously about the need for safeguarded land. Yorks Hospital is now well past its sell-by date, according to its anticipated life, and decisions about moving it to a more accessible location crop up on a very regular basis. I don't act for the hospital, but it's just a case in point. I've no doubt that on the basis of the council's plan as currently proposed, a new hospital would be able to pass the very special circumstances test if a new site were to be proposed in the green belt. But that doesn't apply for everything else. All of the things we can't think of, we don't know about, that might crop up between now and 2041, would have to go either down the very special circumstances route or be dealt with by reviews of the green belt boundaries whenever the plan might be reviewed. And I just suggest that rather than giving certainty, which is what the council wanted to achieve, that would fundamentally undermine the credibility of the green belt. Thank you.
So in terms of a change, Mrs. Hubbard, are you saying therefore safeguarded land should be included?
Yes.
Well, I ask that because no, it's fine. I'll leave that question. Mr. Butler.
Thank you, sir. Obviously, corroborate a number of the comments made from the table, particularly Mr. Keogh's and Mr. Natkus just now, because they support the strategy we put forward in our hearing statements in respect to the options for expansion of our sites, ST7, ST14. There's two additional points I just wanted to pick up on, though. The first was this point of certainty of allocation versus safeguarded. Well, the allocations, if expanded, would be in accordance with spatial strategy, so you've got that as a background point. But the key point I wanted to talk about in this respect was delays. So by having allocations, you wouldn't get the delay that's associated with the need to release that land and the time it will take to do so. So if you went with safeguarded, it doesn't happen overnight. The decision to release safeguarded, submitting applications, getting them determined, building them, there's a time lag there. And that time lag is the point where you could argue you most need those homes because you've made a decision to release the sites to deliver the homes they needed. So there's the delay point. And the second point I wanted to pick up was associated with the need for flexibility.
Yeah, forgive me, Mr. Butler. Yeah, you say there that safeguarded land takes a while to come forward. Well, the MPPF says, doesn't it, that local planning authorities should make clear that safeguarded land is not allocated for development at the present time, and planning permission for the permanent development of safeguarded land should only be granted following a local plan review which proposes the development. So it's what, even longer than perhaps you were suggesting. It's just that, you know, people are talking about safeguarded land. It feels like as though it could come forward quite quickly, and so I'm just pointing out what national policy says safeguarded land is.
Indeed, sir, and that argument is ran in many cases in practice throughout the last 5 to 10 years, I'd argue, where councils and authorities have had to bring forward safeguarded sites. That is obviously a judgment needs to be made. The number that I've brought forward, it has taken some time to reach that decision, and yes, and it's happened simultaneously with local plan review. So they happen and they run in alignment and due to a direction of travel, so to speak. But in reality, there is a delay.
Safeguarded land to come forward would require a local plan review, wouldn't it?
Yes, but in theory, yes, if you read the PPF in verbatim, but in reality, they do happen side by side. Example of which a site I brought forward in Barnsley recently, where at the same time the local plan review was taking place, we were putting applications on safeguarded sites. The safeguarded site was approved prior to the local plan being adopted. However, the safeguarded site was a draft application.
I can't vouch for Barnsley.
It's just one example.
Not these days, anyway.
No, well.
But I can only read the words that national policy says, and I can only say that insofar as this plan is concerned, if the council were to bring forward sites for safeguarded land, the policies allocating that land would be in line with or consistent with national policy, irrespective of how local authorities up and down the country might choose to implement such policies.
Indeed, and it was just probably a point of concern associated with the enduring nature of the green belt for the wrong reasons in that respect. My second point was to do with the headroom point and this idea of flexibility in the market, and more associated with the fact that if we look towards the end of the plan period, it's been rightly identified there'll be 2 sites. One's probably going to deliver apartments, the other will deliver housing, but we're talking 2 sites. So I think if we are looking, when we're re-looking at numbers and safeguarded sites or expanded allocation sites, we need to bear that in mind in terms of having more of a flexible supply when the time's needed. Thank you.
Mr. Lane.
Thank you, sir. I think most of my points have largely been covered by this side of the table, one of the benefits to being at the end of the row. Couple of quick points, however. We heard from Mr. Wood in justifying why no safeguarded land had been provided, that it was the council's view that it was difficult to assess those sites. Mr. Knack has made the point that a large amount of sites were identified in the 2013 draft local plan, and they were assessed by the council and found to serve no greenbelt purpose or didn't need to be kept permanently open. And to add to that, I know a number of people around this table, including myself, submitted a significant amount of information with those or associated with those sites, including layouts and all the technical reports necessary to make an in-depth assessment. The council clearly had the evidence if they wished to allocate safeguarded land. It is my position here, sir, which chimes with Mr. Nackis's, is that the council can do what they have elected to do and allocate more land for development rather than safeguarded land. So just to make that clear, but I think one point that has not really been articulated so far is it's not necessarily the council use what they call headroom, which is just pure numbers to justify their position. I understand the council's case. However, my view, sir, is more about the need to provide a 5-year housing land supply which I don't think come 2033 and up to 2038 the council will be able to do so. As we've heard already, they've only identified 5 sites, which certainly aren't going to provide the range and choice of sites envisaged by the MPPF. I think the fact that they will not be able to identify a 5-year housing land supply will mean that there will be an early review and the Greenbelt won't be permanent. My final point, sir, is that the new MPPF 19 requires councils, if they're under-delivering or if they're under-delivering, to have an action plan. Now, if they haven't got safeguarded land, to my mind, so they haven't got a plan B that they can undertake a review and have a readily available amount of sites to bring forward as that action plan, sir. So whilst I believe the council can do what they are seeking to do, I actually think the allocation of safeguarded land is a better solution as it does allow that flexibility. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, sir. I think most of the points that I was going to make have already been made, but just to sort of pick up on those particular points, I think Mr. Keogh's point about if there was ever a plan that needed a longer lifespan, it was the one of York. And I think the fact that many people have been waiting decades to get a plan would suggest that we ought not to be thinking about coming back immediately to review it. I think it needs longevity. The point we made about safeguarded land is that we were in support of safeguarded land, but I'm very similarly minded to Mr. Napkis on this one, is that if the council decides that the better route is to allocate more over a longer period, then equally that would achieve the same goal. However, the policies as currently drafted in this plan, I think, refer to 2038, and that's also referenced in the Greenbelt Policy SS2. Now, I'm not certain as to whether the council has today made the decision to change that policy by way of its timescale, and I'll come back to I'll leave you, sir, to come back to the point of that. Because
I can probably help you out there. The council, I can't remember what day it was on, but the council put forward a main modification.
Well, if that's the case, then I'd be comfortable in seeing the council to allocate to 2040, but I think the trajectory that we've got currently doesn't reflect that point. And the points made by the gentleman on my right about how the number of sites dwindles down post-2033 wouldn't then deliver on that case. So my point would be, I think we need to come back to the trajectory at the phase 2 stage, because, for example, ST8 this year is delivering 35 dwellings already. So I think that the trajectory needs a little bit of an update in order to have the point in the discussion on deliverability.
Yeah, for the avoidance of any doubt, I will be looking, assuming we get to phase 2, Mr. Wright, I will be looking at supply delivery, including 5-year housing land supply and the trajectory.
Thank you, sir. And the final point, I think, it was already previously made, is that, on my understanding, if you adopt this plan later next year, hopefully, then the life of the plan...
I won't be adopting it at all, ever. That will be for the council.
Sorry, sir. If you endorse the adoption of this plan at the end of next year, then the plan itself up to 2033 has got a lifespan of 12.5 years. And I don't think that's adequate. And those are my points. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Yeah, my apologies. Even though I used it earlier, I can't remember your name and I can't see your name.
Yeah, Mr. Pittam. Yes,
Mr. Pittam.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to preface my comments by saying that I am not a planner or a consultant or a developer. I am a citizen of York, concerned about the most disadvantaged people in York. It's been a huge expansion of my education sitting around this table for the last couple of days, learning how another world operates. But I do want to just make a couple of points. Firstly, about the headroom point in terms of the Gypsy and Traveller strategy. The numbers that are actually in the plan actually only go up to 2032, and so there is no consideration within that for further numbers, and you know, we will challenge those numbers when we come to looking at policy H5, but there's no consideration of that. And the other thing that I think we really just would like to point is that the policy that the Council is actually advocating in terms of thinking about gypsy and traveller provision seems to be saying that this needs to be done in association with the site. What we don't know, and we have got no indication of, is whether any conversations have been happening with the developers of those sites, because we don't know actually how valid it is. What we do know is at this point in time, there is no site provision in York in the local plan. And on the basis of that, we would argue that the plan is unsound. Now, it may well be that we could encourage the council to actually look at some of these development sites and see how feasible that they are. Because we do know, and the Boroughbridge case has been mentioned here, that the Boroughbridge Road inspector actually took out the idea of the Section 105 payment for traveller sites, saying there is no indication of where the pitches would be located, when they would be provided, and how they would be delivered. And basically, those are our key arguments from the York Travellers Trust, that those points have never been arisen. And bringing this back into the argument about the Green Belt, we want to emphasise again that government policy says that as soon as the inner boundary of the Green Belt has been decided upon, then there can be no provision for future traveller and gypsy accommodation. And so that is a key point from where we stand in saying, you know, this local plan does need to really think this through. And if we are going to move on to phase 2, I hope that you might encourage the council, because we've been encouraging them for 2 years to do some further work on this, and it's not been forthcoming. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pittam. Mr. Rawlings.
Thank you. The issue of where necessary, the necessity is due to the permanence of greenbelt boundaries enduring beyond the planned period, particularly the inner boundary in this case. The Council's reasoning for no safeguarded land is on the basis that these larger strategic sites can accommodate beyond the planned period and thus providing headroom. The issues of deliverability surrounding large sites could push the proposed housing delivery further into the next planned period. Bearing this in mind, where is the flexibility to pick up the slack within this planned period? As for identifying sites for allocation or safeguarding, I would urge previously allocated sites on the urban fringe that have previously been deemed suitable by the Council to be at the forefront.
I'm conscious, Mr. Linus, that I've taken quite a few points. What I was planning on doing is taking just one or two, depending on how lengthy they're likely to be, and then give you the opportunity to gather yourselves over lunch.
Yes, we assumed that was the way it was going, sir, and we would have suggested that if you hadn't. So we're content for everyone to have their say before lunch, and then we can come back. And,
I'm not prepared to leave it quite that long.
Really? Okay, very well, sorry.
Sorry, sir, I've by dropping my nameplate. So I've assumed
I see.
my stage name for this response.
Right, take it away.
So one of the considerations that I think you need to bear in mind when determining whether or not there should be safeguarded land is whether or not it is possible to identify sufficient land to meet the likely future needs of the city
in a manner which is likely to be consistent with safeguarding the primary purpose of the York Greenbelt. We've already heard from the Council that a large number of the sites that they have already identified as allocations are going to cause some harm to the primary purpose of the York Greenbelt. And in some cases, we would say considerable harm to the primary purpose of the Greenbelt. One of the reasons why many of the areas of safeguarded land were taken out of the plan was also because the assessment showed that their future development was likely to harm the primary purpose of the York Greenbelt. I think there is a real challenge, sir, in identifying sufficient land to ensure a permanent greenbelt without actually causing development that actually harms the primary purpose of that greenbelt.
Mr. Sudbury. Yes,
I was about to start waving at you.
Oh, there we are, right, yes, okay, very good. My apologies. Mrs. Cook, first of all.
That's all right. Thank you very much, sir. First of all, can I say how we welcome the Council's concession that they will look to allocate more if you decide that the housing requirement needs to be increased. Point number one. Point number two, we agree that the NPPF does not does not require land to be safeguarded. It's those magic words, only when necessary, and plainly the primary purpose of the Greenbelt, as advocated by Mr. Smith, is a factor that one has to take into account here. But also, and this is that factor that has led to the strategy, we have here ST15 and the new settlement, and that offers the ability, as the Council have already pointed out, to deliver homes beyond their 32-33 plan period. And just to remind you, as a heads up, I'm after another 50 hectares and rather more housing, and I'd like to remind the Council of that point, as much as yourself while they're thinking about the answer to your earlier questions. But it's also fair to say that the trajectory that we produce, and so whether you, perhaps the most convenient point is Appendix 5 of our response to the modifications, which I think is SID 378, you'll see our trajectory, and it looks at the ST15 numbers as well as the 4,000 odd Langwith. But in either case, it is going beyond the plan period. And that must be one of the key reasons why, as in Guildford, which also had another new settlement, one of the key reasons why we would suggest that, in fact, this isn't a case where one needs to safeguard. This is a case one needs to make the best out of that new settlement. And we look forward to coming back to that theme in phase 2.
Mr. Sudbury.
Thank you, sir. There's been a lot of debate about this period, 2031, 2032, 2033, 2038, 2040. I think what all this shows is that it's the flexibility. And part of that comes in the fact of, we've discussed last week that we've got new national policy, and we're going to have to reflect that through plan reviews. So really that's where I believe that safeguarded land comes in, to deal with that uncertainty, to deal with that changing context. And that's why the safeguarded option is a good option. I mean, yeah, obviously it's been applied differently across the country, and that really comes down to the circumstances of different authorities. building on the points of Mr Grundy and Mr Lane, the whole of, it's setting aside some of the points yesterday, the majority, if not all of York is within the Greenbelt, and therefore it does take you towards the inner boundaries. And that really builds on the discussion yesterday in terms of where these long-term defensible boundaries are. And whether that's safeguarded land, white land, or whatever, it's about getting those boundaries right. So I do believe that safeguarded land does have a purpose in terms of providing that transition and dealing with subsequent plan reviews, whether it's at what point in the 2030s. I think the other point I'd like to add is just we've got a plan before us which does look at large strategic allocations. So the fact that we're bearing in mind that point about the inner boundaries and those small parcels of land, quite clearly the council would have more information about the small distinct parcels of land that could be safeguarded as opposed to these large strategic allocations. So the point the council made about not being able to assess safeguarded land, we just don't accept.
Mr Johnston.
Thank you, sir. There's 2 points from me. The first is a clarification. Earlier you asked the council about their employment supply, and I understood the answer was that they've provided enough employment land till 2041, and then they pointed you to 7.42 of the TP1 addendum. Just looking at that quickly, my reading is that that's till 2038. So clarification sought on if it's 38 or 41. Whichever the case, we support the concession that they will look to allocate land until 2041. The second point, and this is where I'm struggling and veering into employment needs, but we've heard lots about housing, some about education. I think if I just say the points made are equally applicable to employment and just as important, and we'll leave it at that. In terms of safeguarding and additional allocations, to illustrate the point, with specific reference to office, the council identifies just one allocation specifically for office to meet its needs across the plan period and beyond, and that's York Central. And they've allocated the site for 100,000 square metres. The application that's been approved on that site includes 70,000 to 87,000 square metres of office space. So there's immediately a shortfall against that allocation figure. The phasing of that office development is also back phased to phases 3 and 4, not expected to be completed until the end of the plan period. I could go on to, I think I'll stop at that, and I will save it till phase 2, but the point being, it illustrates why it's so important to allocate land and safeguard land, and the council's assertion that they've over-provided, in our view, is not correct.
Okay, it is now 1:13. I'll adjourn the hearing to resume at 2 o'clock. Thank you.